Hi everyone, in this tutorial we're going to be covering the Dodge tool in Photoshop, the Burn tool, and the Sponge tool. Alright, let's get started. All three tools that we're going to be using for this tutorial can be found right here underneath the Dodge tool, this pin looking icon here, and if you click and hold the rest will come up. So we have the Dodge tool, the Burn tool, and the Sponge tool, and all three can be brought up by using the shortcut key O. So the Dodge tool allows you to brighten up certain parts of your image, the Burn tool allows you to darken certain parts, and the Sponge tool lets you saturate or desaturate certain parts. So instead of doing it to your photo overall with an adjustment layer, if you want to just brighten or darken certain parts of it, you can do it with these tools. The only thing about these tools is that the changes you make are permanent, so it's not going to make an adjustment layer where you can go back and delete it or make changes to that later. These changes are going to be permanent to the photo, so just be aware of that. Okay, so before we get started, since the changes we do make are permanent, I'm just going to make a duplicate of this so we have a backup in case we want to go back to the original. So what I'm going to do is just right click, hit duplicate layer, and I'll hit OK. And now we have a cobblestone copy. So now we can work on this one. If we don't like our changes, we'll just delete that and use our old one here. I'm also going to open up my history panel so I can go back through my history if I make too many changes and want to back up a bit. I'm going to do that by hitting my history panel here. If it's not on the side here for you, go up to Window and then just select your history panel here. Okay, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so we can see the entire photo. And we'll start by using our Dodge tool. So the Dodge tool is going to brighten up certain parts of our image. Okay, so we have some settings up at the top here. You can choose your brush, and I'm going to go with just the soft round brush. We can choose the range, so this will let us lighten either just the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. And then we have our exposure, which is like the intensity. Right now it's set to 50, but I'm just going to turn that up to 100 just so you can see a better example of it. Okay, I'm going to brush through different parts of the image now and just show you some examples. We're going to start by just trying to lighten up our shadows. So if I click and drag over the shadows, it's hard to see, but it's starting to lighten up the shadows in here. If I just go back through my history, you can see that. And you'll notice when I click once, I can click and drag over what I've already clicked on, and it's not going to lighten that anymore until you let go of the mouse button and then click again. So you can click once, drag over everything that you want, and then if it's not light enough, instead of going over it while you're clicked, you have to go back, unclick, and then just click again. Okay, so that's lightening up all the shadows in here. If I switch this to midtones and click through here, what it's doing is just brightening up these midtones. I can go over that a couple times. So you'll see the difference from when I brighten the midtones compared to when I brighten the shadows. This isn't even affecting the shadows at all. It's leaving those untouched. Okay, then I'll go to the highlights and I'll just brighten up in here. So you can see the difference we get between our shadows, mids, and highlights. Right here it's only brightening up our shadows. Here we're getting those midtones brightened up. And here we just get those highlights brightened up. Alright, I'll go over the Burn tool now on the same photo. And again, I'm just going to duplicate this so we have a backup. And I'll paint on this one. Okay, so I'm going to click on this and go to my Burn tool. And the Burn tool is like the opposite of the Dodge tool. It's going to darken up sections of our photo. So like with the Dodge tool, we have the same options up here. We could choose our brush. We could choose the range we want to affect. I'm going to start with the shadows, and then we can adjust our exposure. I'm going to crank that all the way up to 100 for now, just so you can see a good example of it. Okay, so I'm going to darken up the shadows here. And when I paint over it, you can see all it's affecting are the dark shadows. It's not really affecting any of the mids or highlights. I'll switch this to midtones and go through the middle here. And you can see the difference in what it darkens. And now I'll go with the highlights. So what that is doing is just darkening up our whites in the scene in the bright colors. This one's darkening up all our mids, and then this goes for the blacks in really dark colors and then darkens those up more. And then you can use these two tools combined with each other to just darken certain parts and brighten certain parts. So let's do that. Let's darken up our shadows. I'm just going to go over the entire picture. And let's lighten up our highlights. And you can see the difference that makes. But just remember, you want to use this one sparingly on your images because any changes you make are going to be permanent to your image, and you're not going to be able to go back and adjust those if you go too far in the history here. Okay, I'm going to close out of this one and I'll show you some more examples of the dodge and burn tool as well as the sponge tool. Okay, so I have this image here. I'll zoom out a little bit. I also forgot to mention with the first image that you can't use any of these tools on a smart object. So right now this is set to a smart object, and you'll see I'm getting that no icon right here, so I can't draw on it. It's going to give me this pop-up that says the smart object must be rasterized. So you could rasterize it right through here if you want by just hitting OK, and then it's going to rasterize it for us. Okay, now I'm going to show you what the sponge tool does. And again, I'm just going to make a duplicate of my layer here so I have a backup. And we'll use this one as our working layer. So what the sponge does is let you desaturate or saturate parts of your image. And we have similar options up here. You can choose your brush, and you can choose your mode, whether you want to saturate or desaturate. And we also have the flow, which is the same as the intensity. So we can turn that down and it'll be less intense, or we can turn it up for full intensity. So let's start by just trying to saturate it a bit. So just like with the other tools, you just paint over. And if I hold, it's going to saturate only so much, and I can brush over and it won't saturate it anymore until I let go of my mouse and then click again. And you see it's just saturating those colors of what I'm painting over. Okay, I'm just going to back up through my history and I'll show you what the desaturate does. It's already a pretty desaturated photo, but we'll go to the desaturate and then paint over it. And you see we're taking away all that color and turning it into a black and white. So I can click again and desaturate it even more. So this is cool if you want to just go through and just adjust certain parts of your image, or if certain parts have too much color and you want to just knock it back a little bit, you can come in with the sponge tool and do some spot adjustments like that. I'm just going to back up to where we were with it before, and I'll show you some other examples with the dodge and burn tool. I think I want to darken up some of my shadows in here. So I'm going to use my burn tool. It's already set to shadows. Our exposure is set to 100, which might be a little bit too intense, but let's just try it out. And I'm also going to make my brush smaller. You can do that by going into your brush settings here and just dragging your brush size here. Or you can just use your bracket like you do with your normal paintbrush. Okay, so now that I have the brush size I want, I'm just going to brush over some of my shadows here. And I'm also going to make a duplicate of this first so we have a backup. Alright, so as I paint over it, you see it's only darkening up the shadows. It's leaving the mids and the highlights alone. I can do it over here to get this shadow darker, all of these shadows, and you see it's just affecting those shadows. Now we can also come in and use our dodge tool and maybe brighten up our highlights a bit. And so if I go over where I've adjusted the shadows, it's not brightening those up at all because we're not brightening our shadows, we're just brightening the highlights. I could go in and select shadows and then brighten up those shadows that I darkened. And that's way too bright, but you get an idea of what we're doing. So if you wanted to do an overall brightening or darkening, I would do that with an adjustment layer. But if you just want to go in and spot correct certain parts of your image, this is a great way to do that. And I'm just going to close this and show you one more example. I'm going to first start by rasterizing this layer, and then I'll make a duplicate of it. Instead of right-clicking, you can also grab it, drag it to the new layer, and that's going to make a copy as well. Okay, so if we grab our burn tool, and maybe we want to just darken up our shadows. I'm going to turn the exposure down now because we don't want it to be so harsh. I'll set it to 50. I'm going to make my brush a little bigger and just go over some of these shadows. You see it's just nicely darkening those up, and with the exposure down a bit, it's not so intense. It's a little more subtle. And so if I were to change this to midtones, it's not going to darken this up anymore, but it's going to go through now and just darken up those mid greens in there and some of the oranges in here and all the mid-tones on the road here. If we want to dodge, and we could brighten our highlights. Right now the exposure is set to 100, so we'll put that down to 50 as well. And I'll go through and just try to brighten up some of these highlights. They're a little shadowy here, so maybe we can brighten up the shadows on them. I'm going to select shadows, and I'm going to make my brush smaller. So right now it's not allowing me to make it smaller, and that's because this is selected right up here. So what I'm going to do is just click off and then come down, and now I can do that. That's just a little glitch that Photoshop has, so if you run into that problem, just make sure you click off of it. Okay, I'm going to make my brush smaller and try to brighten them up a little bit. So that's brightening up their shadows. I can also brighten up their highlights. So it's brightening up a little bit on the ground here, so you don't want to do that. I'm just going to undo, and then you can zoom in, make my brush smaller, and then just come in and brighten up those highlights. I could also use my sponge tool if I want, and just come in and desaturate parts of this image. Alright, so those are some different examples on how you can use the dodge, the burn, and the sponge tools. And that's going to do it for this tutorial.